everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Sunday, April 16th. A very happy Easter to all of you. Today, as we like to do on Sundays, we'll be chatting with our good friend Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. Foreign policy is the big story again this week. Talk of war. We just dropped this big bomb in Afghanistan, which I'm happy that we did, because I think it really sends a message that we will do whatever it takes to win. And I know that that's a message the military wants to hear, because they're the ones out there. And it looks more and more like the military is running these wars, meaning the commanders back at the White House are actually listening to what the commanders out in the field are proposing, and that's the way it should be. The commanders in the field should be the ones who should be making these decisions. Very interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about this, about the fact that more and more commanders feel like they're actually listening to them in the White House rather than micromanaging their situation. North Korea is again in the news. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen there, but you got Japan, South Korea are watching. China is also watching. They tell me that China has a lot of leverage with North Korea, but I haven't seen it yet, unless it's all being done in private. I have not seen it. President Trump said that the state of U.S.-Russia relations is very bad right now. That's interesting, especially after those years of the Cold War, but we'll hear what Bill has to say about that. The elections of 2018 are still a year and 7 months away, but there's already a lot of talk, a lot of strategy. There was a special election last Tuesday in Kansas where the Republican won easily, not perhaps in the margins that you would expect, but he did win. And now there's one coming up in Georgia. The challenge there is that there's 10 or 11 people running. So I don't know who's going to get 50%. It probably will be very tough to get 50%. So more than likely there's going to be a runoff. And Bill wrote a very interesting article this week about Indiana and sanctuary universities. I thought it was the right message by the state of Indiana. Before we get to Bill, I just wanted to share this with you. This is a personal note, if I may. This is the first time that I can ever recall, certainly in my life, and maybe in the history of the church, that we can actually say happy birthday to a pope who is retired. Pope Benedict is 90 today, and we say happy birthday to Pope Benedict. I don't think there's ever been a time before where we've had a pope retired. Maybe so, and I don't know the entire history, but I think it's fascinating that we have a pope in retirement who turns 90 today. So happy birthday, happy number 90 to Pope Benedict, who left, of course, his office a couple of years ago for Pope Francis. Let's say hello to Bill Katz, the editor of Urgent Agenda. How are you, Bill?
Oh, just fine, Silvio. It was a remarkably nice Easter Sunday today, one of the nicest days we've seen in many, many months. It was 85 degrees in New York, and a very quiet day, thank goodness. A good day for a religious observance.
Absolutely. It was a very nice day here in Dallas, a little humid, but it was a very nice day. Bill, I just wanted to bring up for a second, I'm sure you've heard about it, and that is that yesterday, Saturday, April 15th, was the 70th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's, the first game that he played with the Dodgers. And I wonder if the people who were there that day at Ebbets Field realized how important that day was, that they were watching really one of the most important dates of the 20th century, not just a baseball game, Bill.
Actually, there were some articles on that just this week on what the reaction was in Brooklyn when Jackie Robinson was brought up. And one of the commentators was saying that there wasn't that much of a reaction because it was Brooklyn. I mean, Brooklyn has a large, even in those days, a large African-American population. The term African-American wasn't used then. And it was the North. And there was already talk of Jackie Robinson. Apparently, this was not a complete secret. He didn't suddenly appear. As I understand it, he had taken some batting practice at Ebbets Field. So when he was brought up, it was a new experience to see a black ball player actually playing in the major leagues. But it wasn't the shock that I think people assume today that it was. Not in New York. but in other places it was. And there was it often depended on an individual on another team who might have a problem with this. It might have depended on where the game was being played. Remember, in those days, when 1947, which I remember very well because I remember listening to Dodger baseball on my parents' little Emerson table radio. We didn't have television. Television really didn't start coming in a big way until about a year or two later. But I remember listening to it, and I don't recall, and I was an avid Dodger fan, such a big commotion over Jackie Robinson being the first black major leaguer. He was there. He played. He did a terrific job. People liked it. The fan attendance at Ebbets Field increased because his very presence drew in a number of black fans, which was actually one of the purposes of bringing him up from the minors. But part of it was a commercial purpose. We have this, new population in Brooklyn. Let's get them into the ballpark. And excuse me. And why not? But in other cities, there was a player in Philadelphia named Ben Chapman, who gave Robinson a very hard time. When Robbie was, we called him Robbie, was out on the field, Chapman would yell racial insults. And Branch Rickey, who was the manager of the Dodgers, I don't recall exactly what his title was. He wasn't the on-field manager. He was the kind of the guiding force behind the Dodgers. He told Robinson, "You must not answer back." That was part of the agreement, that you will not shout back if somebody taunts you. And it was very hard for Robinson, who was not that calm a man. He really wasn't. But he was able to maintain that discipline, and that was correct. That was good advice, because he made the racists make fools of themselves. He didn't come down to their level, and he just kept playing, and he played damn good baseball. I don't recall what happened in some of the other cities. There were only 8 teams in each major league in 1947, and a Western trip ended in St. Louis. Isn't that amazing? We call that a Western trip.
Right.
Ended in St. Louis. They took trains. They didn't take planes. I don't recall. I don't really think there were any southern teams. I think the southernmost team in either league was probably the Washington Senators. It was mostly northern and midwestern. Detroit was represented, Chicago was represented, Cincinnati, which had a southern contingent, St. Louis, which a border state. But I don't recall there being any incident so important that it made the history books. There was some taunting of Robinson.
Right. And I think just another quick trivia question about that day in Brooklyn. Robinson, who ended up playing second base with the Dodgers, was actually the first baseman that day, on opening day, April 15th. And another thing, too, that came up in some of these discussions, somebody was asking the question, why did they start the season so long, or so late, April 15th? Now they usually start the season April 1st. Well, one of the reasons is they play more games now. They actually play 162 versus 154. But the other big reason, which is really the more important reason, is that they used to play a lot more doubleheaders back then. Just about every Sunday, they would play a doubleheader, and that meant that you could start the season in the middle of April and get it over by the end of September, Bill.
Oh, sure, and I went to those games. I recall once going to a doubleheader in the Polo Grounds, which up to that time was the longest doubleheader in history. And we didn't even stay for the full second game. We just went on and on and on and on. And, yes, they played a lot of doubleheaders, and the game has so completely changed over the years. First of all, many more games these days are night games, so they can bring in the television revenue. There were many fewer night games. In fact, there were some fields in those days that didn't even have lights. I don't believe Wrigley Field had lights. Maybe it was Comiskey Park. It was one of the two Chicago Major League fields. They didn't have lights for a long, long time, and the teams eventually realized that the baseball television revenue was much greater at night because you had all these people home, and they could watch the game. Now it seems that almost every important game is played at night. That was a television thing. But I remember when television came in, how remarkable it was for us to watch the Brooklyn Dodgers or the New York Yankees on a little 10-inch RCA screen. It was phenomenal.
Right.
Nobody had ever seen a game at home. It was impossible
right.
to contemplate. And that, of course, changed baseball completely. It's not the same game today. It really isn't.
Oh, no.
I don't find it terribly enjoyable to. It's hard to root for a guy who makes $26,000 just for standing up to at the plate, you know. And we even thought rooting for the Yankees. Of course, we were in Brooklyn. Rooting for the Yankees, as Roger Kahn, the great baseball writer, said. He said it was like rooting for U.S. Steel. I mean, it was considered beneath us to root for the Yankees. You were rooting for capitalism. You know, I mean, it was the best team money could buy. So we rooted for the Dodgers. We went to the park. We felt we knew these guys. They would go out to there was a seafood restaurant in Brooklyn, and after each game, a certain number of Dodgers would be there, but it was understood that you left them alone. You didn't go over and ask for autographs. You could see the players come out after the game and be met by their wives. They drove Pontiacs. They didn't drive Mercedes-Benzes like today, and they were kind of part of the neighborhood. I mean, it was a wonderful atmosphere. It really was.
Well, a couple of things that I wanted to say before we get to all the serious stuff about Jackie Robinson. There was a huge ceremony in all of Major League Baseball yesterday in every stadium, and all of the players wore number 42, which was his number. So I thought that was very cool. The other thing, too, that I read that in 1950, he was the highest paid Dodger.
Yes,
and he was making $35,000 a year. So I just wanted to bring that up, and which of course at that time was probably a pretty good salary.
He was a very good player. There probably was some resentment over that, but I suspect that they paid him that amount of money because it was inevitable that once the Dodgers integrated, that other teams would. And that was now I think the American League took a while. I think Larry Doby was the first American League black player, but I suspect the Dodgers paid him a lot to keep him. You know any major league team that was thinking of integrating in the late 1940s would want Jackie Robinson. I mean, he was the name, so I'm sure they paid him that amount because he became a hot property.
That's right. No, just a great thing. We wanted to reminisce a little bit about Jackie Robinson 70 years later, which is an amazing anniversary. Well, I was saying in the presentation, Bill, that foreign policy seems to be the order of the day. This is a president, ironically, who ran against involvement overseas. And I'm not saying that he's getting himself involved, but he ran with a different kind of foreign policy than seems to be happening. And you have a situation in Afghanistan. Why don't we start there, where we dropped a pretty big bomb. I guess they call it whatever they call it, the mother of all bombs, whatever they want to call it. But to me, the most important thing is not the bomb itself. The most important thing, Bill, is that it looks like the military is once again running the show in the battle zone. That obviously they have to report to their commanders at the White House, but they're the ones making the calls, and President Trump is giving them the leeway to make these kinds of decisions. Dropping this bomb was actually something that the commanders on the ground made that decision, Bill. And so it's a good situation. If you're going to be involved in a war, you better get your commanders involved, and you better listen to what they have to say. I thought that was one of the biggest mistakes that President Obama made, when the commander requested more troops and he didn't give it to him back in 2009 regarding Afghanistan, Bill.
Yes, and that was also the mistake that Lyndon Johnson made. One of the mistakes that he made, and that is he tried to run the war from the White House. You can't run the war from the White House. I mean, there could be major strategic decisions made by political officers. There were in World War II. They had conferences like the Tehran Conference to make major decisions as to where to invade in Europe, Northern Europe, Central Europe, or rather Southern Europe, and other major decisions. But once those decisions are made and the overall plan is set, you must let the military fight the war. And fortunately, Trump understands that. He has an excellent advisor in General McMaster. He has an excellent Secretary of Defense in General Mattis. For the first time, we may be getting true professional management. Obama had no interest in these things. He really, I mean, the more and more we see and think about the Obama administration, the more and more one feels that it was a failed administration, in part because he didn't really know how to be president. And I'm not at all sure he was all that interested in learning. I think one of Obama's problems is he came to office with a much higher opinion of his own abilities and knowledge than actually existed, and I think it hurt what he tried to do. Trump is basically turning the military action over to the military. Now, I don't know how far that will go, because when it comes to things like North Korea, there is a situation where strategic decisions have to be made. We are not engaged in North Korea, in other words, as we are in Afghanistan with real troops. And there are all kinds of discussions, which I'm sure you've heard on television. Will there be military action? Won't there be military action? I don't know. There was the failure last night, one of many failures of a North Korean missile. There is a great deal of speculation that we hacked the computer system in some way and caused it to explode. I have no knowledge of that. But whatever it is, they're eventually going to succeed. They are not going to give up on these things because of some failures. They have the atomic bomb, that we know, and they want to match it to a missile that is capable of reaching the United States. And if that happens, that places us in great danger because you're dealing with an irrational regime. It also places us in the position of having to expend enormous amounts of resources, monetary resources, to buy missile defense systems that could actually work. And not a situation we want.
No, and I guess the frustrating part for me, you've got Japan and South Korea. They're obviously watching what's going on because, they could be potential victims of one of these crazy missiles. But I'm getting frustrated with China because all I hear is how much leverage they have. And, well, maybe they really don't have that much leverage, Bill. Maybe this has been something that has been exaggerated, how much leverage they have. But publicly, at least, they don't seem to be doing anything to lower the volume. They seem to be watching, and I don't, I'm not. That's the frustrating part for me, Bill, in this whole thing. That we may be dealing with a situation in North Korea where there is simply no happy options, Bill.
There aren't any happy options. The happiest one would be that North Korea stands down, does not conduct any more tests of nuclear weapons or of missiles, but I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that happening. If they didn't conduct more tests, they would in effect be telling the world the United States has won. And I don't think that this young crazy fat guy, as John McCain says, is willing to do that. We have faced irrational regimes before. We make an assumption sometimes that governments must act rationally, and they will in the end act rationally. Japan did not act rationally when it attacked Pearl Harbor. Germany did not act rationally when it invaded the Soviet Union. Governments, including governments of great powers, have been known at times to act irrationally, and I think that is our great concern about North Korea, that if they develop weapons capable of reaching the United States, they might either use them or they might invade South Korea and dare us to try to stop them, saying, well, if you try to stop our invasion of South Korea, we may attack the United States, and then we have a real problem, don't we?
We sure do. And then there's, 10, 20 million people sitting in Seoul, South Korea, who would be, many of them would be exterminated by any kind of a military attack. We're going to take a little break, and we'll be back with Bill right after this.